the one hand, I want you to see just how important this creational framework is and how influential it has been in Western ethics. At the same time, I want you to keep in mind that we're only getting started in the kingdom's story. There's already a lot to work with, but very little has been explained. And I think that ambiguity helps explain why we have these proliferating, competing, and conflicting models of ethics in the world. They're grounded in a spot that doesn't have enough information to give us definitive answers to what goodness is or how to attain it. Let's look at how some of those models of ethics compete and conflict in our current era. Tom Wright has a lovely book called After You Believe, which begins with a portrayal of how current Western cultures tend to pursue goodness either through imposing rules on behavior, and that reflects a goodness results or a goodness merits or even a goodness gets kind of behaviorist mindset, or pursue goodness by being true to themselves, and that would be a goodness expresses mindset, either an essentialist one if it's based on tradition and human nature, or a non-essentialist one if it's more Nietzschean, more existentialist. He's writing the book because both of those kinds of approaches tend to frustrate and fail. In fact, they polarize one another. A rules-based approach finds appeals to authenticity and self-expression to be chaotic and frustrating, whereas an ethic of authenticity tends to find other people's rules ill-fitting and unnatural. I think the biblical book of Numbers demonstrates this really well. Numbers describes failure after failure in the wilderness among the Hebrews. They express themselves, and every time they do, things go wrong, and God heaps another pile of rules on them. And the rules don't work to solve the problem. It just perpetuates another acting out on Israel's part and another set of rules. The book feels like the sad drama of an adolescent family where every new transgression brings a new rule, and not only do the new rules not work, they produce unintended side effects that exacerbate the problem, or at least don't solve it. These rules don't have to be counterintuitive revelations from another plane of existence. They can be ordinary common sense rules. Don't murder, don't steal, don't covet, don't commit adultery, don't dishonor your parents. These are pretty common sense rules across lots of societies. So rule-based ethics, even ones in the Bible, can be natural law ethics. They can be rules of behavior that make sense. Nevertheless, they rarely work as advertised, and societies often cope with them by evolving double standards. Rules for you, indulgence and authenticity for me. Hypocrisy and corruption are qualities of rule-grounded societies. So in the rest of Wright's book, he explores virtue ethics. He and Peter Kraft are among many who prefer virtue ethics' emphasis on second nature, or realized human potential, not the kinds of qualities that arrive in us at birth, or even evolve naturally in a society, but the kinds of qualities that need to be cultivated. Qualities that emerge under discipline, a second nature of fulfilled human potential, not just raw human potential. You see virtue ethics across cultures, but still Aristotle gets the pride of place as developing a virtue ethic that is influential at least all over the West. For Aristotle, virtues are habits which flow into actions. Those are directed by what he calls right reason, all according to a properly disciplined human will. And when all of these things are working together, this yields a second nature of human excellence. It embodies fulfilled human potential, which Aristotle says is the goal or the telos of human nature. Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt uses a metaphor of an elephant and a rider. The elephant is that human nature that needs disciplining, and yet it's powerful, and it's so powerful that it can do what it's going to want to do. The rider is the intellect or the will, which doesn't have the power to control the elephant, but which can guide the elephant, especially responding to when the elephant moves in a direction that's unwanted. Virtues contrast with vices. Vices are also habits, and they also flow into actions, but they are directed by passions. They are directed by that elephant in Haidt's analogy. Vices exhibit either excess or deficiency, and they fuel it. They encourage further excess or further deficiency, and those drive human failure rather than human excellence. They demonstrate unrealized or frustrated human potential. Even Christians who have a robust doctrine of sin need to bear in mind that vices don't always reduce to sins. For instance, let's say I have a fearful personality. Let's say I'm timid, maybe for good environmental reasons in the way that I grew up or traumatizing experiences I had. Well, that fear, that spirit of fear, the Bible might call it, is not necessarily a sin. It's not something that I have to pay for or something I'm guilty of. Nevertheless, it can be a vice which drives failure in my life, which becomes habituated and powerful, and from which I need deliverance. We haven't received a spirit of fear, but of power, the New Testament says. I mentioned that virtues need to be cultivated, and vices can be cultivated as well, but the natural tendency is towards vice. If you don't cultivate a garden, then it'll deteriorate, it will degrade, and so will virtues if we don't pay attention to them. Any athlete knows that. You have to stay on top of your game if you're going to have a good one. N.T. Wright's example of a virtuous life is Chesley Sullenberger, the U.S. Airways pilot, who saved a plane full of passengers because he was so well trained and his judgment was so well cultivated as a pilot that he knew exactly what to do when birds destroyed both engines in his plane on takeoff on one New York morning. That kind of skill set takes years to develop. And that kind of judgment doesn't just develop along with the skill set. It takes an unusually virtuous person to be able, in the moment, to make all those decisions and make them well. So Aristotle thinks virtue is something human beings can do in our present situation. And Kraft and Wright, who are Christians, think virtue not only is something that belongs to the present creation, but something that respects and invites and experiences new creation as well. Aristotle described 4 cardinal virtues. The word cardinal comes from the word for hinge. They are hinge virtues in the sense that they are necessary for a shared good life, anywhere. And those 4, he says, are temperance or moderation, prudence or wisdom, courage, and justice. These 4 are distinct, but they also depend on one another. And if you lack one, you don't get 3/4 of the way to a thriving human life. You're still vulnerable to being ruined by excess or deficiency in that one area. Speaking of that, for Aristotle, a virtue is the result of attaining a golden mean, just the right combination, between an excess vice, a problem of too much, or a deficiency vice, a problem of too little. So courage is the golden mean between the excess of rashness or recklessness and the deficiency of cowardice or timidity. Aristotle claims that every virtue works this way, but he doesn't name the vices of excess and deficiency that together can become a virtue in every case. And it's not clear to me that every cardinal virtue necessarily works that way. There are also other ordinary virtues besides these 4. It's just that these 4 are the hinges on which things depend. More minor but real vices are magnanimity, greatness of soul and care for others, generosity, and so on. Different ethicists' lists differ, although they do overlap considerably. Now, we're talking about so-called creational virtues, right? We're talking about ethics that are grounded just in the first moment of the kingdom's history, in the goodness and purposefulness of creation, which hasn't been revealed all that clearly yet. Wright wants to talk about what comes next, and he highlights the novel virtues among Christians of patience, of humility, of chastity, and of charity or love. These aren't on Aristotle's list, and Wright finds it significant that they're not, because it took something new, I'm going to say something greater, to produce a story in which those virtues came to have necessary places. Yet, because we live in a Christian or a post-Christian society, those virtues have come to be understood as necessary, and they've come even to be treated by those who don't believe in God as general revelation, as qualities that are, or at least ought to be, obvious to anyone, including outsiders. Historically, though, they weren't obvious to observers. They weren't readily discovered and discerned through general revelation or through the creation in general, and they didn't arrive in our ethics that way. They arrived in our ethics through the influence of the gospel. So just because we claim a virtue is creational, or just because we claim that a virtue or a rule or an expression is creational, it's not clear that it actually is. You have to go through the history and find out, where did this originate from? What I've given you are the opening moments in the basic classical and then Christian model of virtue. Like the book of Proverbs, it's useful and it's true. It's good. Like Proverbs, it's simplified. In fact, it's purposefully simplified. And therefore, it's limited. And sometimes its limits are severe in the way that in economics, a model like the supply and demand curve, which does so much conceptual work and which is so useful, also has limits, and sometimes severe limits, which is actually what most of the discipline ends up concentrating on. Also, like Proverbs, this creational virtue ethic looks universal and it can easily be taken as universal, but it's very subtly contextualized to a broader framework, a broader goal. The book of Proverbs does not sit on its own. It's part of Israel's story, and it's located within the moments of the kingdom's epic saga. So if we abstract it from that greater saga, if we isolate it and examine it as if it stands on its own, we'll learn a lot, but we'll also miss a lot. We've already managed to cover a lot of schools of ethics and a lot of visions of goodness just in looking at basically what's described in Genesis 1 and 2, with supporting work from Proverbs, Psalms, some New Testament texts. Of course, the creational ethic is available all through the kingdom's story because we're still in creation. Paul is describing an old creation which is still with us, still old. As we've seen, the proliferation of models of ethics and visions of goodness creates a problem that they can't themselves solve, which is which one in which situation applies. A fully satisfactory vision of goodness and a fully satisfying and workable ethic is going to depend on that something greater, that something that hasn't arrived yet. In fact, in Genesis 1 and 2, it has barely even glimmered on the horizon. That's the point of John 1 and Hebrews 11:3, which I've mentioned already. They want to point us far beyond what we've seen so far by displaying a grander teleology, a greater and deeper goal to all creation, which they have seen revealed now in the coming of Jesus. Creation has a goal that lies far above and far beyond merely the maintaining or even merely the restoring of this old creation. And that means that even the best creational ethic, if it stops here, is going to be radically incomplete and inadequate. Because original creation, the original and current universe, is the object of new creation, to take it far beyond that good beginning point to where it was intended to end up in the first place. That means we have not left Greek virtue ethics behind, nor have we left divine command ethics behind. The church found both of them adaptable, not just to describing the old covenants and the old relationships in the old creation, but also to describing Christ's work in salvation. So these schools of ethics will return in forms that have accommodated that new information from the kingdom's disclosure. But that's getting far ahead of ourselves.